I recently received a message about a video I made several years ago on my life-size Jabba wall plaque, which you can see here. Watch the video if you want to know all the details, but briefly, it was created by John Coppinger, the sculptor of the Jabba puppet from Return of the Jedi. He created it using a mold taken from an unused latex casting of Jabba's face that he had salvaged from the production of the movie. In the video, I had shown a photo of the original skin that the plaque was based on, and while I knew that Mr. Coppinger was on the right here and Toby Philpott, one of the puppeteers inside Jabba, was in the middle, I didn't know who the person on the left was. As it turns out, he was the one who had sent me the message. His name is Michael Nielsen, and he's from Denmark. Amazingly, he had apparently started watching my videos for the 3D printing projects and was surprised to see himself in the video when he stumbled across it in my back catalog. He said he had some more photos from the same day that this one was taken and offered to send them to me, so naturally I said yes, and we got to talking a bit on Messenger. It seems that he had been involved in booking Mr. Coppinger and Mr. Philpott to appear at some conventions in Europe, and in conjunction with that had been invited to Mr. Coppinger's home and workshop in the early 2000s, where he had been shown some of the things that he had salvaged from the production of Return of the Jedi, including this face, which would later become the plaque that I have, some parts that made up Jabba's eyes, although it's my understanding that these aren't screen-used versions, they're probably sort of earlier prototypes, and part of Jabba's tail. And this is very interesting to me because the face was actually an unused casting and not something that had actually appeared on screen, but this is the actual tail that they used for Jabba in Return of the Jedi. Of course, most of the foam latex that had covered it has long since rotted away. I've talked with Mr. Coppinger a couple of times via email, and my understanding is that the tail was essentially salvaged from a dumpster, and all the rest of the puppet had more or less rotted away by that point, even in the 80s. According to Mr. Nielsen, he had been allowed to take 2 or 3 pieces of foam latex rubber right from the tail, just as a sort of souvenir, and he's had those for close to 20 years at this point, but he very kindly offered to send one of those pieces to me for free, and I was very touched by that offer, and I took him up on it. But before we look at the piece itself, I need to take a minute to tell you why this has some special significance for me. Around 12 years ago, a company called Wattographs, that specialized in Star Wars autographs, announced that they would be making a connoisseur series autograph for Jabba the Hutt. I already had their Salacious Crumb connoisseur series photo, and I was, of course, very interested to get the Jabba version, which promised to be a scaled-up version of the same concept. Basically, they would go around to people who were involved in the creation of the character and get them all to sign a single photo, making a really cool display piece. They had done this kind of thing a few times in the past, including this very impressive piece for Ewoks from Return of the Jedi, including dozens of people who had played Ewoks in the film. And Wattographs promised to have quite a variety of people sign the piece, including the sculptor and puppeteers and so forth, but also more obscure people, like the person who made Jabba's eyes bulge, or maybe the person who burped for Jabba on screen, that kind of thing. I thought it was a cool concept, so I signed up. Basically, they would have individual signings, and you'd pay little by little as they got more people to add to the piece. They even announced, after getting Mr. Coppinger to sign the piece, that they would actually be giving each person who had signed up a small piece of latex skin from the original Jabba puppet. I assume Mr. Coppinger kind of just offered it to whoever it was they had do the signing, but it was a really cool little bonus. I remember telling my son, who was 4 years old at the time, about it, and he was just really fascinated about the idea that we would get a tiny little piece of Jabba's skin. And, for a while, it seemed to be working just fine. They would send along pictures of people signing it, and maybe ask for our input if they wanted to add a new signer, for example. I remember them doing that with Ben Burt here, who basically was in charge of all the sound involved in Star Wars, as well as designing Jabba's voice. But after a while, communications sort of started getting spotty, and there were people on forums and on Facebook sort of trying to figure out what was happening. And long story short, they never actually supplied the pieces to any of us, and most of us were out hundreds of dollars in the end. That's bad enough, but people like Stuart Freeborn here, who was extremely influential in the creation of a lot of the special effects for Star Wars creatures and so forth, has unfortunately since passed away, so we can never get another signature of his on a piece like this. There was never one moment when we could point to where we could say that, oh, this is where the project ended and we're definitely never going to get our pieces back. In fact, people on Facebook and on the forums have been discussing this for literally years. There have been a lot of comments saying, well, you know, my daughter was in preschool when this started and now she's entering high school and we still don't have these pieces, that kind of thing. I discovered by accident that some of these at least did get out onto the market somehow, and some other people managed to get them, not the people who originally paid for them. This is actually a photo of the finished piece, and unfortunately it's the closest I'm ever going to get to having one. Funny thing is that my son really couldn't care less about the autograph aspect of this, but he was very interested, as I mentioned, in that little bit of Jabba skin, and he would ask me maybe once every 6 months or something like that, sometimes more frequently, when are you going to get that Jabba skin? And I would have to basically tell him that it wasn't going to happen. And that brings us to the subject of today's video.
And here is the piece in question. This is a piece of foam latex rubber, as far as I can tell. It seems to be about 1 inch by a half an inch. And it's got kind of a orange coloring to it, yellowish orange. I'm not sure if that is the original color of this or if it has sort of yellowed over time. Let's go ahead and take it out of here and get a closer look at it. Probably shouldn't be handling it that much, but, you know, it seems to be all right. It's actually not crumbling away or anything like that, like you might expect. It is still pretty soft. So here it is. Now what I'm going to do in a second is switch over to my phone camera, because that has a nice macro lens on it. Actually, that works surprisingly well. But for the moment, I'm going to show it on sort of a wide shot. And you can see, you know, it doesn't really look like anything if you didn't know what it was supposed to be. And that's the funny thing about this kind of collectible. You know, they sell things like swatches of the sail barge from Return of the Jedi, or you know, little bits of Ewok fur or something like that, and you kind of have to know what the story is behind it for it to be meaningful. But I do know the story behind this one, and I got it from the person himself, so I think that's really cool. And the fact that it kind of fulfilled that decades-long desire of mine to have a little bit of the original Jabba puppet made it all the more meaningful to me. It was funny, when I heard that this was coming, I talked to my son, who is now 16, and said, you know, do you remember that piece of Jabba skin I was supposed to get? And he interrupted me and he said, yes. He definitely remembered. So he was almost as interested as me to see this when it came in.
With this macro camera, you can really see the individual holes that make up the foam latex. It almost looks like a natural sponge or something like that. Now, according to Mr. Nielsen, this came from the tailpiece, and I'm not entirely sure if it would have been like a visible piece of skin or something maybe that made up the inner workings a little bit more, but regardless, I think it's fair to say that this is part of Jabba's skin from Return of the Jedi, and I'm really happy to have it in my collection at last. I am going to try and come up with some sort of way to display this and hopefully preserve it, so if you have any ideas on that front, maybe let me know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this extremely drawn-out look into a tiny little piece of rubber. I'd like to offer my thanks to Mr. Nielsen once again for generously offering to send this to me, and thank you for watching. If this is your kind of thing, you might want to look into supporting the channel on Patreon, just as these Palace VIPs have done, and my other patrons as well, especially Angelica Brady. I really appreciate the support that they give, and in return they get things like early access to some videos, behind-the-scenes posts, and more. Check out the link in the video description if you are interested.